Why do modern Londoners dress in black and march for a murder that happened 370 years ago? England, January 30th every year. In the heart of vibrant modern London, silent black-clad shadows suddenly appear, marching through the streets. They are not actors, nor part of a costume festival. They are commemorating one of the bloodiest political dramas in royal history, the day a king was beheaded by his own people. On this very day in 1649, King Charles I stepped onto the scaffold. But the drama had begun long before that, at an unprecedented trial. Can you believe it? The king refused to remove his hat, stared directly at the judges, and challenged them. By what authority do you judge your sovereign? That morning, the cold was so severe that the River Thames froze. Charles I asked to wear 2 thick shirts, not because he feared death, but because he did not want his body to tremble from the cold, lest the crowd think their king was afraid. One single blow of the axe, the head fell, an entire dynasty collapsed. But the madness did not end there. To prepare for the funeral, they actually stitched the severed head back onto the king's body. Outside, meanwhile, the crowd surged toward the scaffold, soaking handkerchiefs in the king's blood, believing it could cure all diseases. More than 370 years have passed, yet the scar has never healed. Royalists still dress in black and march every year to remind the world that history never dies. It merely hides beneath layers of mourning cloth. It was the day when royal power collapsed, making way for the England we know today. This is one of the most shocking events in European royal history, commemorated every year on January 30th. For the first time in history, a reigning king was publicly put on trial and executed by his own people. After the execution, they even stitched his head back onto his body to prepare him for a funeral. To this day, every year on this date in London, royalist supporters still dress in black and march around his statue to commemorate a bloody political drama. Many people assume that after more than 370 years, this event belongs only to history textbooks. But no, every January 30th, London once again witnesses a scene that feels like it has stepped out of a historical epic film. The procession of black-clad ghosts. At the equestrian statue of Charles I in Charing Cross, considered the central point of London, hardline royalists and historical societies gather in large numbers. They wear traditional black clothing and mourning ribbons. They lay flowers and stand in silent tribute at the foot of the statue, the very place where, in the past, the king killers were executed in retaliation for the monarch. The solemn, mournful atmosphere in the heart of a bustling modern London creates a strange and haunting contrast. At the very house from which he stepped out to walk toward the scaffold, now a tourist site, special memorial ceremonies are still held every January 30th. Participants believe that the soul of the martyred king still lingers somewhere among the ceiling paintings of Rubens. The reason the events of January 30th, 1649 continue to be commemorated is that they represent the birth of modern England. Without that axe blow, future English kings would never have understood that their power had limits. January 30th reminds the British people of the price of freedom and the dangers of bloody civil wars. This political drama stands as a reminder that history never dies. It merely hides beneath layers of black garments marching through the streets at the end of every January. The execution of King Charles I on January 30th, 1649 was not only a historical milestone, but also a full-scale tragedy, packed with shocking twists that fundamentally reshaped humanity's understanding of monarchical power. Below are the dramatic details and madness surrounding this event. The most dramatic point lies in the fact that Charles I was not assassinated in a dungeon or overthrown by an ordinary coup. He was publicly put on trial before a court established by Parliament. Charles I refused to remove his hat and refused to acknowledge the court's authority. He argued, if the king is the source of the law, how can the law judge the king? Out of 135 appointed judges, only 67 dared to appear, and 59 signed a death warrant. These men were later labeled regicides, the killers of a king. To understand this legendary legal confrontation more deeply, we must look at the extreme tension between two ideologies: the absolute divine authority of the king and the authority of the people represented by Parliament. Here are the darkest and most dramatic corners of this unprecedented trial. In reality, not all members of the English Parliament wanted to put the king on trial. To make the trial possible, the army carried out a swift purge. Colonel Thomas Pride led troops to block the doors of Parliament, arresting or expelling those members who sought negotiation with the king. Only about 80 hardline members of Parliament remained to pass the act establishing the High Court of Justice. This was an unconstitutional act under the legal framework of the time, because the House of Lords had flatly refused to participate. The trial began on January 20th, 1649, at Westminster Hall, where symbols of power confronted each other head-on. King Charles I entered the courtroom without removing his hat. In the diplomatic conventions of the era, removing one's hat signified acknowledgement of superior authority. By keeping his hat on throughout the trial, Charles declared, "No one here is worthy of my bow." One extraordinarily dramatic moment occurred while Charles was speaking. The silver head of his scepter, the symbol of royal authority, suddenly fell to the floor. The entire hall froze. The king waited for someone to pick it up for him, but no one moved. In the end, he had to bend down and retrieve it himself, an image that came to symbolize the collapse of royal power before the force of civil authority. This was the most intense intellectual confrontation between King Charles I and Chief Justice John Bradshaw. Charles did not bother to defend himself against the charges of treason and murder. Instead, he attacked the legitimacy of the court itself. He repeatedly asked only one question: "I wish to know by what authority, by what lawful authority, I have been brought here." He asserted that he was king by divine mandate, and that subjects could not judge God's anointed. John Bradshaw responded with an early form of modern democratic thought. The king is not an individual, but an office entrusted by the people through law. When the king betrays the law, the people have the right to reclaim that office. The fact that 135 judges were appointed but only 59 signed a verdict revealed a profound crisis of conviction. Many judges feigned illness, fled to the countryside, or simply refused to sign the sentence out of fear of retribution or future royal revenge. Numerous anecdotes claim that Oliver Cromwell had to seize the hands of some members and force them to sign the death warrant. Some stories even say that after signing, Cromwell and another judge jokingly smeared ink on each other's faces to release the unbearable tension of committing regicide on paper. The final verdict declared Charles I to be a traitor, a murderer, and a public enemy of this free commonwealth. This marked the first time the concept of crimes against the people was used to condemn a king, rather than the traditional charge of treason, which usually meant betraying the monarch. Do you want to know more about the antagonist who confronted the king directly in court? Chief Justice John Bradshaw, who reportedly wore armor beneath his robes out of fear of assassination. On the morning of January 30th, 1649, in the bone-chilling cold of London, King Charles I prepared for his death with an astonishing calm. He asked to wear 2 thick shirts. The reason was simple. He did not want to shiver from the cold, fearing that the public might mistake it for fear. He declared himself a martyr of the people. However, standing high on the scaffold and surrounded by soldiers, very few people could actually hear his words. With a single blow of the axe, the king's head was severed from his body. Witnesses recalled that as the head fell, a terrible groan rose from the thousands in the crowd, an expression of collective shock beyond words. January 30th, 1649 was one of the coldest days in London's history. The River Thames had completely frozen over. Against this brutal natural backdrop, the final performance of Charles I unfolded with meticulous preparation, down to the smallest detail, to preserve royal dignity. Here are deeper layers behind this dignified death. Charles I woke at dawn in St. James's Palace. Instead of panicking, he spent time praying and carefully preparing his appearance. This was not merely preparation against the cold. Charles understood that in a public execution, psychological warfare mattered most. If he trembled, even as a natural physical reaction to sub-zero temperatures, Parliament's supporters would proclaim that the King of England had been cowardly in the face of death. He said, "The weather is cold enough to make me tremble, and my enemies would attribute it to fear. I do not wish to endure that accusation." He refused a lavish breakfast, drinking only a little red wine and eating a small piece of bread to maintain his strength and avoid fainting on the scaffold. Instead of being transported by carriage, Charles I was forced to walk from St. James's Palace to the banqueting house at Whitehall. His beloved small dog, a spaniel, later known as the King Charles Spaniel, tried to follow him but was stopped by the guards. To reach the scaffold, Charles had to pass through the magnificent rooms of the banqueting house, where he had once hosted lavish feasts and gazed up at Rubens's ceiling paintings celebrating divine kingship. He stepped onto the scaffold through a window whose lower wall had been broken open. When he emerged onto the scaffold, Charles faced a shock. Thousands of soldiers surrounded the platform to keep the crowd at a distance. His speech was long and deeply philosophical, but it could only be heard by those standing directly on the scaffold, soldiers and officials. For the vast crowd below, it was a silent speech. Fortunately, some people standing on the scaffold recorded his words. He declared, "I go from a corruptible crown to an incorruptible crown." He tucked his hair into his cap so that his neck was fully exposed, then signaled to the executioner, "When I stretch out my hands like this, strike." This is one of the most dramatic details of all. The executioner and his assistant wore masks and fake beards to conceal their identities, fearing assassination and revenge. The executioner delivered a blow so clean it astonished everyone. In history, there are executions that required 3 or 4 strikes, such as that of Mary Stuart. But in Charles I's case, a single blow was enough. There were rumors that the executioner was in fact an important figure within the army, and some even suspected that it was Cromwell himself or his son, though there is no reliable evidence. When the head fell, there was no triumphant cheering. Instead, witnesses described a sound they had never heard before, a choking, anguished groan. At the very moment the king died, the crowd seemed to awaken and realize that they had just witnessed an event that overturned the order of the world. The army immediately had to drive back people who tried to climb onto the scaffold to dip their handkerchiefs into the king's blood. Those cloths were later sold as holy relics, believed to cure the king's evil, scrofula. This execution has been described as the most legalized murder in history. Do you want to know more about how his head was sewn back onto his body so that his family could see him one last time? After the execution, strange details continued to unfold. To prepare for the funeral and to show a minimum degree of respect for the royal corpse, his head was literally sewn back onto his body. After the king was beheaded, the crowd surged onto the scaffold, soaking handkerchiefs in his blood. At the time, many believed that the blood of the anointed sovereign possessed healing powers or spiritual value. Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the parliamentary faction, refused to allow the king to be buried at Westminster Abbey. Instead, his body was taken to Windsor Castle and quietly buried in the vault alongside King Henry VIII. After the fatal axe blow, the atmosphere in London was not one of jubilation, but of dread. What happened to the body of Charles I afterward was a strange mixture of reverent devotion and brutal pragmatism. Below are deeper details about the eerie process of handling the body and the haunting funeral that followed. Immediately after the crowd was dispersed, Charles I's body was carried inside Whitehall Palace. There, an unusual event took place. The body was not abandoned. A group of physicians and embalmers was hired to tend to the king's remains. They carefully stitched the severed head back onto the body with meticulous sutures, so that the corpse would appear as intact as possible when placed in the coffin. His internal organs were removed, a standard procedure of the time, and the body was embalmed with resins and herbs to slow decomposition while awaiting a decision on the burial site. After being stitched and embalmed, the body was placed in a thick lead coffin, which was then enclosed within an oak coffin covered in black velvet. On the lid was engraved a simple inscription, Charles, Rex 1648, according to the old calendar in use at the time. In the mindset of 17th century England, the king was not merely a politician, but the earthly representative of God. The moment the executioner raised the king's head, the military cordon was breached. People rushed forward to dip handkerchiefs, scraps of cloth, even handfuls of blood-soaked earth from beneath the scaffold. They believed that the blood of a martyred king possessed divine power. Those handkerchiefs later became family heirlooms, believed to cure scrofula, the disease that legend claimed only the royal touch could heal. Some anecdotes even claim that his hair was cut into fragments to be made into commemorative jewelry. Oliver Cromwell bluntly rejected the royal family's request to bury Charles I at Westminster Abbey, the traditional resting place of English monarchs. Cromwell feared that a magnificent tomb would become a shrine for royalists to gather and revel. The body was taken to Windsor Castle on the night of February 7, 1649. As the coffin was carried across the castle courtyard, a sudden snowstorm swept in. The snow fell so heavily that it completely covered the black velvet cloth on the coffin. Royalists who followed wept and said, "The heavens have given our king a pure white mourning veil." Because a separate tomb was not permitted, the vault of King Henry VIII and Queen Jane Seymour in St. George's Chapel was opened. Charles I's coffin was hastily placed beside his infamous predecessor. No formal religious ceremony was conducted because the parliamentary faction had banned the use of the Book of Common Prayer. Centuries later, the exact location of Charles I's remains was still questioned until 1813, when workers accidentally opened Henry VIII's vault. The Prince Regent, later King George IV, was present when the coffin was opened. Witnesses described that Charles I's face was astonishingly well preserved, his distinctive pointed beard still intact. When they lifted the head, they confirmed that it had been completely severed from the body and bore traces of old stitches. One physician present at the time even secretly took one of the king's cervical vertebrae, the vertebra struck by the axe, as a souvenir before it was returned in 1888 by order of Queen Victoria. This act of stitching the head and the secret burial transformed Charles I from a failed king into an immortal symbol of royalism. Do you want to know what happened to the bloodstained shirt he wore that day? Today, it is still displayed in a museum in London. This drama did not end with his death. 11 years later, when his son Charles II restored the monarchy, those who had signed Charles I's death warrant were hunted down and executed. Even the body of Oliver Cromwell, long dead, was dug up to be hanged and publicly displayed. To this day, every January 30th, royalist societies, such as the Society of King Charles the Martyr, still organize marches in London. They wear black clothing and lay wreaths at his equestrian statue in Charing Cross, considered the heart of London. The execution of Charles I was the first proof that royal power is not inviolable. It paved the way for the modern constitutional monarchy of Britain today. Do you want to learn more about the tragic fate of the regicides, those who signed a death warrant? The drama of King Charles I did not end with the axe. It stretched across decades afterward through bloody purges and strange commemorative rituals that still exist into the 21st century. Below are the details of his haunting aftermath and his immortality in the hearts of royalists. In 1660, when Charles II, his son, returned to the throne, an era known as the Restoration began. The new king's top priority was revenge for his father. Charles II declared forgiveness for most participants in the Civil War, except those directly involved in signing his father's death warrant. The punishment for treason was the most brutal imaginable. The regicides were hanged, but not allowed to die, then disemboweled while still alive, and finally beheaded and quartered. Because Cromwell had died naturally 2 years earlier, Charles II ordered an act of madness. Cromwell's body was exhumed from Westminster Abbey. The corpse was taken to the Tyburn gallows, hanged in chains, then beheaded. Cromwell's head was placed on a pole outside Westminster Hall for 20 years as a warning. After the monarchy was restored, Charles I was no longer seen merely as a king, but as a martyr saint. The Church of England officially canonized him. He remains the only person canonized by the Church of England since the Reformation. For nearly 200 years, from 1660 to 1859, January 30th was recorded in the Book of Common Prayer as an official day of repentance for the national sin of regicide. People were required to fast and pray on that day. Although the United Kingdom is now a modern democracy, every January 30th, an ancient ritual steeped in darkness still takes place in London. Members of the society and Orthodox royalist groups dress in somber black attire. They march from St. James's Palace, where he spent his final night, to the banqueting house at Whitehall, where he was executed. They lay large wreaths at the foot of Charles I's equestrian statue in Charing Cross. Notably, the statue faces Whitehall, the place of his execution, as if symbolizing that he is still watching the justice done to him. Although Charles I failed on the battlefield and in the courtroom, his dignified death inadvertently helped preserve the monarchy. The public execution of a king terrified the English people with the chaos of the Republican regime under Cromwell. This made them long for the stability of monarchy more than ever. This drama taught later English monarchs, such as Charles II and James II, a brutal lesson. If a king does not respect the Constitution and the people, he can be sent to the scaffold. This became the foundation for the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which shaped Britain's political system today. Did you know that the pale blue silk shirt King Charles I wore at his execution still bears faint traces of blood and is displayed at the Museum of London? Do you want to explore the journey of these strange relics from 1649 to the present day? If it were you, would you stand with the proud king or the relentless parliament? Leave your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to follow to uncover the next classic secrets of royal history.